Hi everyone, I'm Jefferson Calico, and I've got my safety goggles on today and my work gloves on today because anytime you're going to be handling something powerful and possibly dangerous, you need to be well protected. So today we're talking about the concept of sacred power. This is a concept that's very important to indigenous and animistic religions, and it's covered in your book in chapter 2 on indigenous religion. Now, sacred power is something in these religions that we want to obtain for our life because it can impact our life in positive ways, but at the same time, it's also something powerful and potentially dangerous if it's not handled well. So put on your safety goggles and your work gloves, your safety gear, and let's dive into the concept of sacred power. Alright, so when we talk about this concept of sacred power, we really have to see that there are two related ideas at work. So the first one is sacred power itself, which we'll get to. The second is that which we use to protect ourselves from sacred power. And that's the topic of taboo. Now your book contains a section in chapter 2 called Taboo and Sacrifice. Let's see. And we will touch, so you can read through that, and we're going to touch on taboo. First, let's get to the idea of sacred power itself. Sacred or spiritual power. So, what are we talking about? As we have already said, indigenous and animistic religions are centrally concerned with the idea of sacred power. So, what is sacred power? Well, let's think about it this way. All of us have experienced times in life when things weren't going our way, when life seemed less than it was meant to be, when life seemed to be a struggle. So these are times of, for instance, times of weakness or sickness, when things aren't right, even times of sickness unto death. We've experienced times of maybe turns of fortune, when we haven't thrived like we want to, when we don't have enough resources to make it like we feel like we should. We've all experienced times of tension, fighting, a breakdown or disharmony of relationships. And so indigenous and animistic people were very conscious of these times in life when life was very difficult and a struggle, and they realized that, or they came to think that there was that what they needed was an influx of spiritual power that would enable life to go well. So that is the spiritual or sacred power that they were looking for, a power that is available through the spirit world or perhaps out in nature, various ways of obtaining the spiritual power, but it's specifically a power that allows us to thrive, that makes life go well, that helps us to obtain the resources and other things that we need for life to go well. It brings life, it allows communities and people and relationships to thrive and prosper and to be in harmony. It's in some sense the life energy itself. And at times, for indigenous and animistic religion, this power wanes in our life. And when this sacred power wanes in our life, when we're lacking spiritual power, for various reasons, that's when things begin to go badly. So, another question that this raises is, why does our spiritual power wane? Why does it lessen and decrease? And there are several answers to that question. One, of course, is simply by living badly, by living badly, we diminish our own spiritual power. And living badly, of course, is a pretty wide concept. But for indigenous religions, it means to do the wrong thing, to break the rules of our society, to treat each other badly, to become arrogant and puffed up, to obtain too much, to sort of be greedy, and to be ruled by various vices rather than virtues, and to live out of harmony with other beings, whether that's our family, or our tribe, or the animals and the ecosystem. To live out of harmony decreases our spiritual power. But for indigenous religions, there's generally the idea that humans were the youngest and the weakest part of the world, the creation, if you will. So the animals lived closer to nature and closer to the source of spiritual power. So the spirit world that is manifested through the natural world. And humans were the youngest and the weakest and the farthest away from that source of spiritual power. So our batteries just keep running down. We're far from the source. It's difficult for us to obtain spiritual power. We're far from nature and sort of cut off from that source of power. So our spiritual power keeps running down. And we have to come up with ways of obtaining that spiritual power. And that's through relationships with spirit beings. It's through various ritualistic means. It's by going to sacred sites where sacred power is closer and more available, and holding rituals or vision quests or whatever it might be. Also by purifying ourselves, because when our lives are filled up with this negative energy, we need to, and pollution, right? Impurity. Then we need to cleanse ourselves of that through smudging or through a sweat or through other ritual to allow that spiritual power, that sacred power to come back in. So where can we find this sacred or spiritual power? Well, for indigenous peoples, for animistic religion, sacred power is found in various ways. It's found in various places, in objects, and people, and is often obtained through ritual practices. But all these things can be characterized by spiritual power, having sort of been filled with spiritual power, sacred power. So, for instance, places. So there are sacred sites. All indigenous and animistic religions have sacred sites, places, locations that seem to be places where spiritual power, sacred power, is closer and more obtainable. Places where power from the spirit world is breaking into the physical world. And these were often places of great geographical significance, right? Where it's just is evident that spiritual power is concentrated in these places. Here are a few examples. Spiritual power or sacred power might also be concentrated or found in various objects. So there's a story, for instance, in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew and Jewish and Christian Bibles, in which King David is bringing to Jerusalem this artifact from the Hebrew ancient Israelite religion called the Ark of the Covenant. And he's not exactly sure how this Ark of the Covenant is supposed to work. Anyway, so what he does is he puts it on an ox cart and has it pulled by a couple oxen on this perhaps bumpy road up to Jerusalem, where he wants to install it in the tabernacle. And along the way, like I said, it's sort of bumpy and the ark starts to bounce around, and at one point it begins to tip and it looks like it's going to fall over. So this fellow who's walking beside the ox cart named Uzzah, he reaches out to stop the cart from falling, and when he touches it, boom! This power breaks out and strikes him dead. Now, that's an example in ancient Israelite religion of this idea of sacred power. So it was contained somehow, or filled, this object called the Ark of the Covenant was filled with this sacred power. And when it was handled wrongly, it broke out in this very dangerous way. For indigenous religions, another object that might have sacred power is the medicine bundle or a sacred plant. So, for instance, various plants were used for like smudging or smoking. And the idea was that when the plant was burned and released the smoke, that this smoke was the sacred power of the plant being released for cleansing or healing or for whatever use it might be. Sacred power is also found within people. So there are some people who have more of this spiritual power or sacred power than others. And it's also the fact that you can, through various ritualistic acts or various other actions, you might obtain and bring spiritual power into your life. And this makes life go well for you in all sorts of ways, to have this sort of sacred power in your life. Okay, so let's think about electricity for just a minute, because sacred power is in some ways a lot like electricity. So electricity is a great thing. It powers our lives. We couldn't live this type of lives that we do without electricity, and it does so many good things for us. But at the same time, it's an energy, it's a power. And if we come into contact with electricity in the wrong ways, then it can be quite dangerous. And if you've ever come in contact with an electric fence or a live wire, you know about the effects that electricity can have. So that means that when we are working with electricity, we need to take precautions. We need to insulate ourselves from possible negative effects. So this is an example of an electrical wire. Let's say this is the end of the wire, and as you can see here, this blue is the wire itself, and what we do generally is we put around this carries the charge, the electric charge, and we put around the wire generally some sort of insulating material, so that we can hold that or come into contact with that and the charge doesn't break out against us. So we're protected in some way from that electric power. We insulate ourselves from that electric power. And this is exactly what indigenous and animistic people are concerned about with sacred power, is the potential negative effects of coming into contact with sacred power at the wrong times and in the wrong ways. So there are ways to insulate ourselves from sacred power. And that's the idea of taboo. So let me read you a quote from the book. In the section Taboo and Sacrifice, the book says, "From inside Native religions, a taboo is often better seen as a way of protecting the individual and of safeguarding the natural order of things." So oftentimes we think of taboo as some sort of prohibition, a rule about something we aren't allowed to do. But from the perspective of the indigenous practitioner, what that rule does is it protects us or insulates us from coming into contact with sacred power that could potentially harm us. So for instance, I've heard a lot of people say, kids are running through the sanctuary at church, and someone will say, "Don't run in the sanctuary." That's a rule. And why is that? Well, somehow to treat the sanctuary, which is to be a sacred space, right? A place of spiritual, of sanctity, of sacred power, in a sense, where we come close to sacred power. So to run through it and treat it in these sort of callous ways sort of demeans it. It dishonors God, or it demeans God, we can see this as sort of running down the batteries. It drains the experience of sanctity and sacred power, of holiness, from our experience here in the church. Another one that I've often heard is, you don't want to say a curse word because lightning will strike, right? Now, what is that? Well, that's again an example of manna, or sacred power, breaking out against us when we are acting badly. So a rule that we have to protect us from this outbreak of spiritual power is like, don't say curse words at church or whatever. So the basic idea here is that sacred power is a power that can make our life, that is a life energy to make our lives thrive and prosper and bring good things to us. At the same time, sacred power can be very dangerous if it's not handled well. So we have rules, cultures and societies develop rules that insulate us by limiting our behavior, limiting our interaction with sacred power, to protect and preserve, safeguard the use of this sacred power for positive rather than negative effects.